Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today we're taking a look at 3 different wireless earbuds ranging through different types of cost and also feature sets. They're not vastly different in price as you'll see in a second, but the feature sets and the actual ergonomics and design are quite different on all 3. Each of these products has been sent to me by either a retailer or manufacturer, but as always that doesn't influence anything that I have to say about the products. And so what you're about to hear from me is the good, the bad and the ugly about each of these products. This is one of those great reviews where there's really not too much that's ugly, but there are some pros and cons in each cases, so we'll get to those in a second. And so let me start by introducing the Hifi Tin Buds 3, the Edifier W240TN, and the Soundpeats Air3 Deluxe HS. It's a bit of a mouthful. There are multiple versions of the Air3, so what we're talking about here for the entire review is the Air3 Deluxe HS. Let's take a look. In terms of pricing, the Soundpeats Air3 Deluxe HS come in as the cheapest in this roundup here, and they come in with a price tag of $60 US. I want to say a huge thanks to Soundpeats for sending these out. As I said before, they've got no influence over what I'm about to say here, but all in all, I've been quite impressed with what I've heard and seen from the Soundpeats. And specifically, what you're getting from these is a small sort of puck style case with a flip top lid up here, and within the case we've got a sort of semi-open style bud similar to say an AirPods Pro from Apple. So these have the stem down below the earbud, and they sit in the concha of the ear, that's kind of the scoopy bit near the ear canal, and they've got a slight protrusion that just sort of semi-seals the ear canal, but they're not a full IEM, there's no ear tips or anything to worry about, and that's something I really like about these. From a design and a fit and comfort point of view, I think they're excellent. They feel a lot more premium than their price tag would suggest, and their comfort is excellent too. While we're talking about features, a couple of things worth noting with the Soundpeats Air 3, and again I'm just going to say this the last time, it's the Deluxe HS version only. They've got multiple versions which is really confusing. I'm not a fan of that. This is the Deluxe HS. And the reason the Deluxe HS is important and the reason I'm stressing it here is because as I understand it looking at their range, this is the only model that actually offers you LDAC. But strangely it doesn't offer you aptX HD. So you have to make sure that your source device that's going to be sending the sound to the Air 3s, you have to make sure that that's got LDAC because aptX HD alone isn't going to cut it. So just to summarize, the Air 3 Deluxe HS has your regular SBC and AAC, which are kind of your lowest res Bluetooth codecs, and then it jumps all the way up to LDAC. And it's an interesting choice. I'm guessing maybe there's licensing costs, and that's why they haven't gone down the path of putting aptX as well as LDAC. And I certainly prefer LDAC generally. I find it does sound better than aptX, but it was a really interesting choice. I've never seen a device like this before that has LDAC without the others. So that was curious and I thought I should raise it. A couple of other things to know about the Air 3 are that they also have a low latency mode, and I'm going to talk about that because that is one of the challenges with one of these models, but the good news is that the Air 3 do not have any problems with latency, and what that means if you're not familiar with the term is that if you want to watch videos or play games using the Air 3 for your sound, they're going to be spot on with the timing of whatever's happening on screen. There's nothing worse than having a pair of earphones or headphones where the sound is just ever so slightly delayed compared to the footage on screen. I find that particularly troublesome if I'm watching videos or movies where the lips moving on screen don't quite line up with the sound, and it can be quite an uncomfortable viewing experience. So the good news is the Air 3s don't have that problem. They're beautifully in time with whatever's happening on the screen of your phone or your computer. And then beyond that, a couple of other features and specs to talk about are that they're IPX4 rated, which basically means they're going to deal with a light shower, a little tiny bit of sweat, but you definitely don't want them to get drenched in water. We've then got battery life, which is going to be 5 hours per charge in the buds themselves, and an extra 15 hours from the actual case. So a total of 20 hours use from one full charge of the case and the earphones. The Air 3s also offer in-ear detection, which works really well. So what that means is that when you put them in your ears and you take them out of the ears, the earbuds know what's happening and they start or stop the music according to what's going on. It's a good smart feature that seems to work well based on my usage. Sometimes these smart features get a bit too clever for themselves, but I didn't find any issues with the Soundpeats. One final feature to discuss before we get to sound, but it is related to sound, is that there's also an app that goes with the Soundpeats, and that app's going to allow you to play with an EQ that you can either customize an EQ, or you can actually have it do an adaptive EQ, which is going to do some hearing tests. The problem for me though is that when I went to do the hearing test with the Soundpeats Air 3, it was completely broken. And what I mean by that was it uses a system, and I really like this system, where it's going to play each set of tones at a certain volume, and it's either going to play 1, 2, or 3 of those tones. And the idea is that you press a button on screen that tells it if you heard 1, 2, or 3 versions of the tone, or if you couldn't hear it at all. And it's going to use that to work out how strong your hearing is at each frequency. That's all well and good. I actually love the way of doing it. I think it's one of the easiest to work with that I've seen. But the problem for me was that when we got to the higher frequencies, it just started putting out kind of digital hash, sort of a noise. It was kind of a crackly mess. And so I can't really comment on how effectively the adaptive EQ works because the app was a bit broken. But that's not all bad news because the out-of-the-box sound of the Air 3s was just right for me. I really enjoyed the tuning and the way they present the sound. So let's talk a bit about that now. As I've already mentioned, there's multiple EQ modes for the Air 3. And so most of my listening tests were done in what they call the classic setting, and that to me is the preferred preset. I'll talk about some of the other options shortly. But in that preset, they've got what I would call a warm but articulate sound. And for me at least, it suits a sort of mobile use, out and about type IEM, where you need a bit of extra body sometimes to overcome the ambient noise from the environment. Despite being a little bit warm, the overall tonality still sounds natural. Nothing sounds off, it doesn't sound overly thick or bassy or boomy, but it definitely tilts towards warm. The staging is actually quite excellent for a budget true wireless IEM, and I'm putting that down to the fact that they're this kind of semi-open design. They don't completely seal the ear canal, and it seems to allow them to create a bit of extra space in the soundstage. As I've already said, the sound is rich and smooth, but it's definitely still detailed. There's a wonderful sense of detail, particularly through the mid-range of the Air 3s, that I thoroughly enjoy. Certainly, some people might find them just a little bit too rich sounding, and again, I don't think they're overly thick or warm, but those of you looking for a really neutral true wireless are probably not going to enjoy the sound of the Soundpeats in their classic mode. And that richness does also create a slightly intimate sense of sound. So whilst the soundstage has a good sense of width and general spaciousness, it's quite an intimate presentation. The sounds are quite close to you because of that richness in sound. And so for me, I was incredibly impressed with their sound for the $60 price tag. They're an IEM that I can see myself picking up and using around the house on a regular basis and thoroughly enjoying. Before I wrap up there though, I did want to talk about some of the preset EQ settings that come with the Soundpeats via the app. And that is to say that I'm not much of a fan. The adaptive EQ using the sound test, as I've already said, is a bit broken. Once I did sort of get it working, it also made the sound a bit kind of boxy and muddy to me. So I don't know if that was the way the EQ is applied or if it was the way it had interpreted my results and adjusted the sound curve. But for me, it's not a feature I could see myself using. And then as I moved over to the EQ presets, I just found that some of them are way too heavy-handed. Particularly something like folk. When you move over to the folk preset, it just pushes the mid-range way too far forward and pulls everything else too far back, and it overbalances the tonality. And that was true on multiple settings, but the folk one really stood out to me. So I think if you are going to choose the Soundpeats Air3 Deluxe HS as your true wireless IEM of choice, do be prepared to either set up the custom EQ, or just go with the sound that I've described from the classic EQ setting. I do think the classic EQ setting is absolutely all you need. If they provided nothing else, in some ways I might have been happier. I wouldn't have seen the negatives in some of their other presets. Of course, you might also enjoy some of those presets. This is just my opinion and my perception based on the music I was listening to. The long and the short of it though for me is that the Air3 Deluxe HS is a wonderful IEM at its price. The performance of the Bluetooth is excellent. Having LDAC only isn't really a big deal for me at least. My phone's got LDAC, so I'm all set. And the comfort and the sonic performance was nothing short of excellent for the price. And so with that in mind, let's move on to the next highest IEM in terms of price in this roundup, and that's the Hifi Tin Buds 3. Trying to work out what gear you should buy next? Have a look at the Passion for Sound Recommends link down in the description below. Clicking on the link will take you through to my Patreon page, and specifically a post where you can click on the Airtable image to go through to my recommended product database. Once you're in the database, you can use the filter button up the top to choose which sorts of product types you want to have a look at, maybe headphones, maybe DACs, maybe amps. Choose the one or ones that you want to see from this list, and then you can also sort the list by price if you want to, or other features as well. You'll then see a consolidated list just of the product types you want to have a look at, including things like what the retail price was when I last checked. You've got links to my reviews of each product, and then also links to where you can go and buy them. Feel free to play around with the filters and sorting options as much as you like to find the gear you're looking for, and I hope that this database points you in just the right direction for you. So happy hunting, happy listening, and now let's get back to the review. The Tin Buds 3 come in at $90 and I want to say thank you to Melbourne Chi-Fi Audio for sending these over for me to try. And the Tin Buds 3 come in this kind of fairly chunky disc style case or cylinder style case, and it's got a swing top lid on it, which is a bit of a problem as I'll get to shortly. And I don't know if you heard that just then, but they've already switched on and they're in the case. There's a little bit of foreshadowing as to the problem. But before we get to that problem with the case, and I'm going to put it down so it stops pairing and unpairing, before we get to that, I want to talk through some of the specs and sort of the origins of the Tin Buds 3. And that is that they're designed, apparently, according to Tin Hi-Fi, they're designed based on the T3 Plus, and that was an earphone that I really liked. But without meaning to spoil the review, they don't sound much like the T3 Plus to my ears. I think what Tin Hi-Fi are referring to with that connection to the T3 Plus is the fact that they've used beryllium-coated diaphragms within the Tin Buds 3. And something that I really like is they've also focused on the tuning of these being an acoustic tuning rather than relying on DSP. So what that means is that many of the earbuds and even headphones on the market, meaning wireless headphones, many of those don't worry as much about the actual physical characteristics, the acoustics of the cups, the housings and the drivers. They put a little bit of effort into that, but then they fix any issues using DSP or digital sound processing. And that's fine. Theoretically, you can get good results in any direction. But if you do stick to an acoustic tuning, it can often result in better resolution, better tonality, because you're not messing with the frequency response quite as much through that DSP. And where that's important is that any kind of processing you do can be damaging the integrity of the signal. And so I think it's great that they're relying mostly on acoustic tuning. I don't know if it's solely acoustic tuning or if it's like 90% acoustic, 10% DSP, but the point is that the focus is on getting the acoustics right within the driver and the housings, and then essentially just providing signal and amplification through the Bluetooth module. That Bluetooth module is Bluetooth 5.2, so it's a current and up-to-date version of Bluetooth. But unfortunately, what I found when using the Tin Buds 3 was that they do show noticeable lag when watching movies. And there was no way I could find, no documentation anywhere that suggests that these have any kind of low latency mode that I hadn't switched on. It just seems like that's the way they are. So these might be a good earphone for music listening if you like what I'm about to say about their sound, but I definitely wouldn't recommend them for gaming and or for movie watching unless you don't really care about that slight offset of sound. We're talking microsecond delays, but it's just enough that you can notice it when you're watching a movie. The final thing to talk about in terms of specs and features before we talk about the issue with the case and the sound is that the Tin Buds 3 will give you 6.5 hours of use per charge of the earbuds, and an additional 30 hours through the case. So they've got quite a bit more battery life than something like the Air 3. I don't think the Air 3 is lacking in any way, but if you do value maximum battery life, then the Tin Buds 3 do give you more at about 35 odd hours. And so with all those specs and features out of the way, let me talk to you now about what I don't like about the Tin Buds 3 case, and it's driven me absolutely nuts in the time that I've spent with them. As I said before, the Tin Buds 3 case is this kind of cylindrical style case with a swinging lid. And the issue with that is it's very easy to just ever so slightly bump the lid in either direction and it's going to activate the buds. I'll see if I can show you here. I'm holding it towards you. Hopefully you can see the green light. If I just nudge it, it's not going to do it for me now, is it? There we go. Just a tiny bump, and that was actually more of a bump than you need it to do to set off the activation of the buds inside. So the problem with that, and what's happened to me multiple times, these would be sitting on a shelf somewhere. I might have put something next to them or moved them, and without knowing it, I've just ever so slightly shifted that lid and it's activated the earbuds. And then I'm walking around the house, I look at my phone and Bluetooth's active because it's paired up with the buds that are sitting in the case over on a shelf in a completely different room, but they think they're switched on and in use. And it's driven me a little bit bonkers. Because what that then means is that any sound from my phone is going to the buds, but the buds aren't in my ear, so I've got no idea what's going on. So I think that should have been improved. I think that Tin Hi-Fi could have found a better way to handle the way the buds activate. Maybe it's when they're lifted out of the case with the magnetic contacts in there. I don't know what the system could have been, but something needed to be done better. It's not a huge deal, it's not an absolute deal breaker for these, but it's driven me a little bit batty, as I've already said, when using the Tin Buds 3, or more to the point, when not using the Tin Buds 3. So even right now, they're going off in my hand, and I can hear it saying pairing, disconnected, connected, when I'm not actually trying to use them. that means it's also draining your battery. So that 36 odd hours of battery life that I spoke about before, that could easily be gone in smoke, or maybe half gone, just from having them sitting around thinking they're connecting all the time. So I'm not a fan of that at all, but the good news is that sonically, I can say a few good things about the Tin Buds 3, and that is that they provide a very neutral and clean sort of sound. As I said before, to me they don't sound like the T3 Plus, but that's not necessarily bad. It just means don't buy them thinking you're getting yourself a wireless T3 Plus, because I think you'll be disappointed. I enjoyed the warmth and the punch and the dynamics from the T3 Plus, but to me, the Tin Buds 3 are much more neutral, a little bit sterile perhaps. Some of this is in comparison to things like the Air 3s, which are a little bit warm, a little bit rich, but even as I spent longer and longer with the Tin Buds 3, they're a much more neutral tuning. And some of you will love that, some of you might not. As I spent more time listening to them, one thing I noticed, and this seems to be something that happens with metallized drivers, is that it does actually create what I'd describe as a metallic top end. And I don't mean to suggest that you can actually hear that it's metal on the driver. The point is it creates a tonality in the treble that has a kind of metallic sheen to it. It's got a sort of crispiness, edginess, whatever you want to call it. It's just a little bit unnatural. It could be partly due to the tuning. It could be partly due to the way the resonance of the metals plays out with the drivers. I don't know what the cause is. But the point is it does create a slightly unnatural treble from the Tin Buds 3. It's not bad in any way, shape or form, but I did notice it. While I was listening to a whole bunch of tracks through all of these, one of the tracks that came on when I was listening to the Tin Buds 3 was Break the Same by Mute Math. As I listened to that from the Tin Buds 3, the treble was getting just a little bit edgy for me, a little bit forward, a little bit aggressive. In particular, things like the cymbals were just a bit overemphasized to my ears. Everything else I thought was actually quite excellent. The bass had a nice sense of punch, it was tight, it was controlled, it had good impact. But the treble was just throwing things off all the time. And so for me, I'd describe their sound as being overall quite neutral. They've got a good sense of bass, a good sense of punch and extension, and it's done in such a way that it's not throwing off the mid-range tonalities. It keeps everything sounding pretty natural and neutral, but that treble just gets a little bit too much from time to time, at least for my ears. It doesn't get harsh in the sense that they're overly fatiguing, but it does get just edgy enough that it draws too much attention to the treble. It makes the treble become too much of a focus, and it throws off the overall balance of the sound. And so I'd say that the Tin Buds 3 overall are a very good sounding IEM. If you enjoy a bit of extra treble emphasis, if you like listening to details in the treble frequencies, so things like cymbals, snares, the strums of guitars where you want to hear that texture and that kind of actual attack on the strings of the guitars, that's where these could be really good. They're not personally to my taste, but I can definitely see a lot of people loving them. Before I wrap it up there though, I should also mention soundstage, and what I'd say is that I don't think the soundstage is quite as wide as it is from something like the Soundpeats, because we've got a totally closed IEM in the Tin Buds 3 versus that semi-open sort of earbud design in the case of the Soundpeats. But where the Tin Buds 3 actually have a benefit is that they push the sound a little bit further away from the listener. I said before that the Air 3 for me is a little bit more intimate. I like them, but they're a little bit more intimate of an experience where you're sitting a bit closer to the music. Whereas the Tin Buds 3 push that back a little bit with their slightly more lean, slightly more neutral tuning. And so I think both sound excellent. They're very different tonalities, assuming you're comparing the classic EQ on the Soundpeats with the stock sound, which is the only sound of the Tin Buds 3. I think both are excellent with very different sounds. And I just realised with all my talk about the case and how annoying the case is, I never talked about the design of the actual earbuds in the Tin Buds 3. If I quickly pop them out of the case, what you'll see is that they're a fairly traditional kind of what I call a pseudo-custom design. In other words, they're fairly moulded, they're designed to fit fairly snugly into the contours of the ear, and then you just put the ear tip on the end. And so what that means for me at least is they're incredibly comfortable, I can easily wear them for a long time, and they also fit very securely, so I never felt like they were going to fall out of my ear. To wrap up the Tin Buds 3 though, just to reiterate what I've already said, I think they're an excellent IEM for those that are happy with a bit of extra treble. They're beautifully made, they're very comfortable, easy to work with and control. It's just this case drives me a bit nuts, as I've already covered. And so let's put those down and now turn to the final IEM here, which is the most expensive in this roundup, but I think still pretty affordable, and that's the Edifier W240TN. Now as I start talking to you about the Edifiers, I can still hear the Tin Buds behind me here telling me that they're paired. So that again just reiterates how bloody annoying that can be at times. But let's move on now to the Edifiers and talk about a $100 IEM. These come again in sort of a more of a puck style case. They're sort of a rounded off rectangular puck. They've got the same flip top lid as something like the Soundpeats. And then what you get inside are two fairly unique looking buds. They're this kind of interesting moulded, ovalish type design. They've got this funny protruding bit on top with a touch piece in the middle of it. And by the way, all these have touch controls that work just fine. And where the Edifiers differentiate themselves from the others in this review is that these also offer active noise cancelling. So for $10 more than the Tin Buds, you're getting active noise cancelling as well. Before I move on, I should say a quick thank you to Edifier for sending these out. And the first thing I might mention is that funny shaped earbud that I just showed you with the protruding top piece, that houses 2 dynamic drivers inside. So each earbud is a large dynamic driver for bass and probably into the mids a little bit, and then a smaller dynamic driver for the mids and the treble. I don't know the exact crossover points there, so I'm just estimating how that might work. But the point is you've got 2 dynamic drivers, which means you're getting consistent tonality across the whole frequency range, rather than splitting it between, say, a dynamic and a balanced armature. You're getting a very coherent type of delivery from each driver, and then also theoretically giving you a good full range sound. And we'll get to that shortly, but I thought it was interesting that we've got a dual dynamic design here. I've already mentioned that they've got active noise cancelling as well, so that's quite unique in this roundup of these 3. And they do offer an ambient mode too, which can be very handy. Battery life on these is 7 hours from the buds on their own, and then an extra 14 hours from the case. So a total of about 21 hours if you're using active noise cancelling. That bumps up to a total of about 25 hours if you're not using active noise cancelling. And so it sits them kind of right in between the Soundpeats and the Tin Buds 3. I think all 3 of these in this roundup have excellent battery life overall. I don't see any problems with any of them. And so moving on from that, let's also talk about the dust and water rating of the Edifiers, because they've got an IP55 rating. And that means they're going to handle a reasonable amount of dust and or moisture. So you can probably do a little bit more with these. You can do a little bit more kind of strenuous exercise. You could take them out in the rain if you needed to. You could go to dusty environments if you're working with them in, or maybe you're out traveling in dusty places. The Edifiers are going to be the better fit for that. They're still not what I would call absolute all-weather IEMs. They're not like some of the sports models out there, but they're getting really close. The other thing I should mention about the Edifiers before we start talking about sound is that they also offer EQ settings somewhat like the Soundpeats through their own app. And at this point, referring back to the Soundpeats, it's probably a good time to mention that the Soundpeats are pretty unique here because they're the only one offering a true high-res codec for the Bluetooth in this whole roundup. We've got 2 more expensive IEMs in the Edifiers and the Tin Buds 3 that both offer you only, as far as I can tell at least, SBC and AAC connections. So there's no aptX HD or LDAC on either of these other 2. And that's probably a part of why I think the Soundpeats perform so well at their price, is they're getting a very high resolution signal for a Bluetooth signal. And so I thought that was worth flagging that across all of these, in some ways, the cheapest one is the most fully featured. The Edifier obviously does have ANC, but it's lacking in the codecs from the sound quality point of view. But anyway, moving on from that, because there's often more to it than just codecs, if the tuning is good, if the frequency response is good. And so a couple of other things to talk about in terms of sound and use of the Edifiers are that firstly, the ANC works really, really well. I found they blocked out a good amount of ambient noise for an IEM, and having the ambient mode means you can hear what's going on around you should you want to. The other thing worth noting with them is that they didn't show any sense of latency when I was watching movies on my phone. And indeed, that's what I expect from anything running Bluetooth 5.0 and above. So it's kind of surprising to me that the Tin Buds didn't actually give me that zero latency experience. According to the Tin Buds website, they're meant to, but my experience with them was that they just didn't. Whereas both the W240TN from Edifier and the Soundpeats both delivered a true no latency or low latency sound. And so on that note, let me know in the comments down below if you've tried the Tin Buds 3, if you've had latency issues. Maybe it was just something about the pairing with my phone at the time. I'm not sure. I certainly found it to be just a couple of milliseconds off what it should have been, and it was enough that people's mouths were moving on the video before I was hearing the sound. Just by a fraction, but it was just enough. The Edifiers and the Soundpeats, no such issues. And so before we get too far off the beaten track and start talking about latency and fine details of codecs, let me come back around to how the Edifiers sound. And that is to say they sound great. None of these sound bad to me. The Edifiers are another that sound really solid. And using them, and they've also got what's called a classic EQ mode, using the Edifiers in their classic EQ mode, the sound was excellent. They're again leaning towards what I would call rich and warm but detailed, so quite similar to the Soundpeats in that regard. And the staging is again quite good. It's not got much depth to it, which is not uncommon, but it sounds natural and realistic from a staging point of view. The bass has got a good sense of punch and impact when you need it, but it's not overdone in any way. And the treble is extended, so you're getting a good sense of treble detail and sparkle, but there's none of that emphasis that I was picking up from the Tin Buds 3. Again, much like the Soundpeats, some people might find in that classic EQ mode that the Edifiers are just a little bit too rich and warm for them, and that's where you'd probably come back to the Tin Buds 3. But for me, I think the Soundpeats and the Edifiers are both an excellent tuning for an out-and-about kind of portable wireless earphone solution. I mentioned though that there's an EQ option within the Edifier app, and it's a more simple EQ option in terms of the presets. You do still have custom options, so you can tune it to your own liking. Before the presets, you've only got two choices. You've got classic and you've got dynamic. Moving over to dynamic, what I found it did with the W240TN was kind of push the treble forward. It made it a more V-shaped sound overall. And I can't say I'm a fan because it sort of threw off the tonal balance. It sucked out the mid-range a little bit too much. It made it harder to hear vocals and kind of the key instrumentation in music for me. And whilst I think some people might find the classic tuning a little bit too polite, a little bit mellow perhaps, I think the dynamic tuning went a bit too far the other way. It got a little bit too heavy-handed with the V-shapedness, if that's a word, and it made them just a bit too aggressive and pulled back too much on the mids for me. I think a middle ground between the two might just be perfect, and that's where you're probably going to have to turn to the custom EQ settings. And so at this point, I'm going to wrap up by saying that I think all three options here in terms of the true wireless IEMs are fantastic. I think if you need active noise cancelling, it's a no-brainer just to go straight for the W240s. Of course, there's other more expensive options like Edifier's Neo Buds. But if you're sitting within this kind of $100-ish budget, I think the Edifier W240TN are a really strong option if you need noise cancelling. If you don't need noise cancelling, then it probably comes down to the choice of the Soundpeats if you're happy with that sort of semi-open design. I think dollar for dollar, if you're just talking pure sound performance, I think the Soundpeats are the best of the bunch here. But having said that, if you like a more neutral tuning and you don't want to faff around with the EQ settings on the Soundpeats, for a more neutral tuning and or if you want passive isolation with a properly sealed ear canal, then the Tin Buds 3 still have a place. As much as I absolutely hate the case, I've talked about that to death, as much as I hate that, it's still something I would overlook for the fact that I think they are built beautifully, they're very comfortable, very secure in the ear, and I do think they sound good if you like that sort of what I call neutral tuning with extra treble emphasis. If you're happy with that, if you enjoy that, they're a lovely IEM. And so you can't really go wrong here. It's going to come down to which one has the features that suit your needs and also the tuning and the sound quality that suits your tastes. Again, please do comment down below about the latency issues that I heard on the Tin Buds 3. I'll be really interested to hear if other people have found it too. And of course, if there's anything else that you think I've missed, if you want to know, put a comment down below. I'll try and answer the questions if I can about any of these three. For now though, I hope you found the review useful and interesting. If you have, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button, consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.